Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. This is a show called Insight, and we discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes we discuss books that have a historical perspective on the present, and sometimes books that have a broader trend analysis to put political issues into some broader setting. This is a book on Venezuela and its oil economy. It is written by Raul Gallegos, and it is titled Crude Nation, How Oil Riches Ruined Venezuela. Now, joining me on this show today are two Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Kyle Kisner, and to Kyle's right is Madison Liddle. So I wanted to read an opening quote from the book to give you an idea where the author is coming from, and then we'll jump into a discussion about the book. The author writes, "Sometimes it seems as though I would find more openness if I were writing an expose of the sexual lives of Venezuelans. Talking about money and economics in Venezuela has become taboo. In Venezuela, speaking about the economy can get people into legal trouble, and many Venezuelans are forced to engage in illegal activities to survive, to get ahead. Everyone had some unnamed contact that secretly converted dollars into bolivar, the Venezuelan currency. People had two options: deal with black market dollar traders or exchange their money at the official rate with local banks, which made life very expensive. Legally didn't stand a chance. Hugo Chavez became president in 1999 after promising to scrub clean decades of corruption and to redistribute the country's oil wealth among the poor. Venezuela under Chavez wanted world oil prices to go as high as they could possibly go at the expense of U.S. gasoline consumers and pretty much anyone else. Here is a country just 2,700 miles south of the U.S. border that few Americans know about, and yet every time they fill their gas tanks, a few cents go to Venezuela. Venezuela controls the largest reserves of oil in the world."
What we see in this book is being focused on a country that, for much of its history, hasn't necessarily been considered a wealthy country. But in the last 100 years, over the course of the 20th century, you see this economy lives and dies by the rise and fall of the oil prices in the global market. So basically you get a combination of this influx of wealth along with various government reforms from a corrupt government results in what you could call excessive overreach. And initially the idea is to turn things economically to be more equal, and the result is you get this these surges of capital that come and go, which inspire kind of a capitalistic value system in Venezuelan consumers. And at the end of the day, this just ends up being a case of unintended consequences gone awry.
Absolutely. I think there's two main points to the book. It's corruption and oil, and how those two things go hand in hand, and how the upper class is seen as really almost vile to the rest of the country just because of how greedy they've been, and how that's impacted just the day-to-day lives of the ordinary citizens.
He has a quote here on gas prices in Venezuela. He says, "Gasoline in Venezuela is the cheapest in the world. And even writing this doesn't quite capture the feeling of getting a tank of gas practically for free. In essence, the government in Venezuela pays people to drive. Venezuelans expect to get cheap gas and have done so for decades." And so, sort of that feeling of this has an impact on how you're seeing this whole economy function.
Yeah, and one of the very early things he says right in these first few pages that jumped out at me as being very awkward was the way in which cars hold their value in Venezuela. They're not very common, and they're very, very expensive, far above what the book value would be in the United States. However, you can buy a car in Venezuela, and that's a better investment than if you was to go and invest it in some kind of a savings account or mutual fund at one of the banks controlled by the state.
Absolutely. That's kind of a foreign concept to Americans who, get a new car every 10 years and see almost no value in it after you drive it off the lot. So yeah, it was definitely an interesting perspective to look at.
Well, because of the problems in their currency, and you're having very high inflation, so your money, the Venezuelan currency, is going down in value. He said, again giving a good sense, he said, paying the rent of my apartment was another anomaly. I paid my landlord in bolivars, but since the local currency constantly lost value against the dollar, my rent was cheaper every month. Landlords constantly sought to renegotiate contracts, but my rent kept getting lower during my whole 5-year posting in Venezuela, which allowed me to save a tidy bundle. And so you have this sort of situation that spilled over into the idea that since you know that your money is getting cheaper every month, you might as well accumulate a lot of debt.
Yep.
And as a result, it's fine to have debt on top of debt because it doesn't matter.
Right. The response from the local currency ends up being that you can get, he talks about this a little bit later in the book, but you can get a loan for, say, $15,000 to buy a decent car or something along those lines, or decent anything. And if you have that debt a year later, that $15,000 is probably actually already half of what it was when you first bought it. And that's not just month to month. He's actually talking about that by the time a lot of these independent sites that were dedicated to tracking the value of currency against American currency, they were actually not able to update the changes and exchange rate fast enough.
He talks about how that loss of basically worth is destroying their economy because people, it's great for the person who's saving all that money on the loan, but what about the person giving the loan? What about that bank who's losing money hand over foot? They can't keep backing people. Their economy is tanked. There's no innovation. It is what it is because they have no money to back up anything at this point.
Well, that was part of the issue, is they were saying that when oil was coming along, that everybody in the world needed Venezuelan oil. So the demand for Venezuelan oil was so high that as a result, then you had to trade in your currency to get their currency. So now you knew it as a Venezuelan, I could get a lot of foreign currency a ton of it for very few Venezuelan bolivars. So as a result, the country got in the habit of actually producing very little.
Yep.
So they imported everything they needed. And by importing everything they needed, now you get into this bad habit that you're not producing enough of your own items because you just figure everything is cheap to buy overseas. And so as a result, you get into this sort of buying from overseas. And so your economy is so dependent on buying items from overseas. Well, then as your oil price goes up and down, now you're in a severe problem because you've already had this problem that you don't have this infrastructure in the country that allows you to produce a lot of what you need.
Right. And this, you talked about the exchange rate, people coming in and exchanging. That was another sort of element to this story that had layers and nuance. So there wasn't, you can't just come in and know right off the bat that I'm going to get to exchange this amount of money for this rate. There was 3 different exchange rates, and those have actually shifted and changed over time. So a person involved high in the government might be able to get 6.3 bolivars per dollar, but a person who owns a business may only be able to get 12, versus a citizen may be fortunate enough to get 50. So you see this entire black market kind of spring up around all these different activities that the government won't allow people to engage in of their own volition.
Absolutely, which created kind of animosity between the government and the people, in terms of they weren't blind to the fact that this was happening. They knew that they were getting robbed. Businesses were tanking because they had no ability to do otherwise. And so you definitely see that struggle between the common people and the elite class, as you'd call them, the people who are getting wealthy off of this scheme.
Well, it was sort of, when Chavez comes in, he seemed like his economic policies are backfiring. And the book is sort of focused on some of this and the notion that, okay, he's trying to prevent people from getting dollars, and so he's got to control it, which has a big impact on companies. I thought the whole section on toilet paper, how there's a complete shortage of toilet paper because making toilet paper requires some ingredients from abroad. So that means you're going to have to get your hands on dollars to buy those ingredients abroad, but the government won't allow you to have the dollars, so you can't buy the ingredients abroad, so that as a result, the toilet paper companies are short on making toilet paper. And so now you're developing essentially a black market of toilet paper.
Right.
Yeah, that becomes almost a whole side gig that people are engaging in, so much so that a lot of folks are actually leaving their full-time jobs and saying, well, because there's all these shortages, now the lines, you can see images here in America today still of the gas shortages, the long lines for gas. It was like that, though, in Venezuela, but for everything, and the lines were much, much longer. So, and an interesting side note to that was they're talking about these shortages in toilet paper, and they spin it in such a way to say, well, see, actually the shortage of toilet paper means that our people are needing it more, they're eating more because they're defecating more.
Yeah.
So that means that they're doing really, really well for themselves. And the weird part is, as silly as that sounds, is that he actually wasn't completely off base, because the author then goes in and kind of shows that there is a correlation between the up times and the lean times in toilet paper consumption in other nations.
The toilet paper one was interesting because there was this sort of real demand for toilet paper, and so they realized the trucks that were leaving the toilet paper plant, the drivers were stopping along the way and taking some of the toilet paper off of the trucks to sell in the black market. So the government had to step in to the private companies and monitor the trucks, that they had to count exactly how many were in there before the truck left the plants, with the exact time the truck left the plant, and then somebody at the other end, another government official, had to monitor that that truck arrived with the exact amount of toilet paper to make sure the driver didn't stop along the way to take some out to sell it on the black market. So now that created a greater degree of inefficiency, because that added a lot of extra hours, the amount of time that a truck was on the road, and so it spilled over into weird ways. This is sort of an odd economy you have functioning here.
Right, and like you said in your opening statement, it came down to people either existing in the legal sense and being dirt poor, or getting involved with the black market and making ends meet and maybe doing a little bit better for yourself. And that's kind of what we're seeing even in this situation, is that, truck drivers were able to make more money taking 8 packs of toilet paper off the truck and selling them on the black market than they were simply driving the truck to and from where they're supposed to go. So it's an interesting dynamic, and it's a commodity that Americans wouldn't even, think about in that sense. So I thought that was a really good way of looking at it, because it's something that we wouldn't see that way, but you put it in that situation, it really puts it in perspective how bad it is.
Yeah, it was very interesting to me to watch how he explains that the strength of their dollar during World War II, or the strength of the bolivar rather during World War II, was a major, along with the the disruption in economic trade, was really what kind of made them switch from being agrarian farmers who produce their own goods to, well, now they're all going to the cities, and well, it's better just to get a job and live a more urbanized lifestyle.
And as a result, it affected all types of things, because, again, by not producing a lot locally or within the country, because, again, he talked about this with soap and shampoo. And he says that there's certain ingredients that were needed from abroad that had to go into the making of soap and shampoo. So as a result, there's a shortage of those. So then he talks about these different sort of homemade remedies you're trying to make out of local ingredients that sort of are supposed to pass for soap and shampoo, but aren't quite it. But again, you're having these problems of this economy that became so dependent on buying things from overseas.
Right. When in the good times, they kind of crippled themselves because they got really comfortable outsourcing all of their products because it was cheap and easy. When they had money, that was okay. But now that they don't, they have no infrastructure to back up any sort of manufacturing that they need, and they have all these shortages because they can't get the products that they need from overseas now because they have no money to pay for them, or they can't use the dollars that they need to get that. So now they have this crippled economy and crippled infrastructure where there's just nothing there to produce.
And then he went on again. I thought this was interesting, is that you're having sites online that are essentially the black market dollar exchange. And so one of them is called greenlettuce.com. And so the green lettuce rate, and so the green lettuce became sort of a euphemism for the black market, but that it's advertised online. And so then the governments tried to go and shut down these sites, but other sites cropped up online. And so as a result, their ability to sort of shut down these black market sites on the internet weren't very successful.
Right, and that's, as I stated earlier, that's kind of a common thing you see when the government is trying to counteract any sort of black market activity. They simply cannot keep up with, or they can't stay ahead of the 8 ball, so to speak. And really what you're seeing there is it's kind of indicates what the bigger problem is really in Venezuela. And here it would be very common in America for people to say their socialism is destroying their economy, but really it's not that as much as they have a serious problem from the top to the bottom and how they manage their finances, spending freely whilst not giving much consideration to what's going to happen in 6 months.
Here's a quote he has here on plants, so that you're having this chaos of production going up and down. So it says, Chavez forbids companies from downsizing the workforce without an express government authorization, even if the layoffs themselves result from the government's own currency policy. In April of 2015, General Motors announced it had let go 446 workers with a special government approval, but soon the Labor Ministry recanted that decision and ordered the automaker to hire back the workers. And so again, that you end up having plants that when they can't get the parts or ingredients they need from abroad because they can't get their hands on hard currency, meaning other currency to buy things, you end up in a situation where they are going to reduce their production line so they don't need as many workers, but you can't let the workers go in those extreme idle periods.
Right, so what that basically means is the major impact is that, well, no one likes layoffs. That's a pretty much universal fact. No one wants to see people out of work. But the problem here is that if the plant needs to lay off people, they are now forced to pay people less because they have to employ the same number of people to do the same amount of, or less work with the same amount of money. So they have no ability to pay them except for to cut their wages, which only spirals into more poverty and more corruption because people are now making less money for more work, employing more people than you need. And it's just a vicious cycle that they can't seem to get out of.
He was saying the airlines were reducing their flights into Venezuela because then they're getting paid in bolivar, but they want to convert that into the currency of their own country, and the government won't do it. So as a result, they don't want to be paid in only bolivar, and so as a result, you see a reduction in airline flights into Venezuela.
Right, and that's something that it seems like they're relying on very heavily, too, for the tourist traffic. He talks about a number of expats that he's encountered throughout this book, and one of the things that we hear a lot is he talks about this guy from Japan, I believe, who had been living in this luxury hotel for less than it would have cost him to go out and buy a a really cheap used car in America.
He also talked about that at a news conference. He was asking the Ministry of Finance about how come the central bank of the country was not an independent bank, because usually what you do is if you have an independent bank, it tries to control the growth rate of inflation. And so there was a 45-minute rant on television against him asking that question, because essentially the bank there is the central bank doesn't really get involved in helping to control the inflation rate. And so as a result, you have more of a problem of inflation in the country. He then got back into the whole issue of debt all over again, and again talked about the whole notion of that you get into this routine of everybody has debt upon debt, and that you're constantly, well, essentially trying to accumulate as much debt as you can because you know that next month it's going to go down your payments. And so that seemed to be a very big issue. And so that and the constant rebirth of inflation, and that how you ended up having the dollar, or rather oil demand, go way up in the 70s. This is during the period where you have the 1973 oil war in the Middle East, and from that oil prices shot up. So Venezuela made a ton of money. But then you got to the oil glut of the 1980s, so now the price went way down, so now the country goes up and down in these oil shocks.
And it's interesting that a lot of people would say, well, you know, this is the lean times, that's when they should be cutting back on programs, that's when they should be reducing, having people standing around making a wage while doing nothing. But when they did try to take those countermeasures, the backlash they got from the Venezuelan population was so great that they essentially had to go back and recant all these restrictions and continue to give this sort of lavish lifestyle that the population had become used to.
He had a quote here on how you saw inflation. So inflation is driving up that you're going to have to need more of your local currency to pay for things. So he says, during my years in Caracas, Venezuelan landlords preferred to find a brand new foreign tenant every year instead of renegotiating a lease with the same renter, because it was easier to keep up with the boulevard's plunging value by raising rents 40 or even 50%. I was forced to move 3 times during my 5-year stretch in Venezuela. And so because the price kept, you then had to keep raising your rates to make the same amount. He talked about the same thing in restaurants, that a lot of times in the restaurants you didn't see a price on the menu, and so that you're trying to figure out what it is you're paying when you eat.
Right, and I think again, it goes back to that exchange rate. What exchange rate are you having access to? And so he's talking about how you might pay $45 for a burger from McDonald's, or if you're getting this other exchange rate, you might pay $1.50.
Now, the other one I thought was interesting, he talked about there's an increase in unwanted pregnancies because of condoms and birth control pills from abroad. So that once again, you're having this problem where to make condoms or to buy them from abroad, you can't. So there's a shortage of condoms, there's a shortage of birth control pills, and he said when these were not manufactured in Venezuela, so once again you had an item that was spilling over to affect sort of a social aspect of your economy.
Absolutely, and now a poor country has even more mouths to feed, and it's a vicious cycle. This is a historical problem. This has been going on for years and years and years, and we're so deep into it now that, where do you even start to correct it? Like you pointed out, Kyle, it's not that these people don't recognize this. It's there, and they don't like when you change the programs, because then they don't get paid what they are already expecting. They're used to this lifestyle. This is kind of what they've been adjusted to. So when you start to correct it, where does that start? Where does it end? How do you actually do that in a way that doesn't completely ruin the lives of your people? There's just so many elements to it that can't even be seen until you're already knee deep in it.
If I have this pronounced life, he called it a bacacaro, which was a job that because there were always long lines for any of the stores, and so people had to spend a lot of time waiting in line to get anything, so people would quit their jobs to become line waiters, just to wait in line to buy things and then get back in line again to buy something else. So you created a title for this job, which they called it a vaquero, and so that you realized that you could make more money just waiting in line to buy things to sell to people than you could by having a regular job.
Yeah.
And so he says that he realized there were a lot of people that were doing this. Venezuelans have chosen to abandon their jobs in established companies to work as vaqueros, especially if their formal jobs pay minimum wage salaries, which a vaquero can out-earn with minimum work, standing in line for several hours, and later selling shampoo or toilet tissue in the streets with a generous markup. And so he talked about that in several places in the book and how you began to see that happen.
It's kind of like the idea of we're approaching Black Friday. It'd be the equivalent of going and fighting the lines for that to get bread for your family and turning around and selling it to someone for twice what you paid just because you can make more money off of it that way.
Not even twice what you paid. I mean, he talks about these different products like toilet paper and hygiene items. They're being government controlled so that people can afford them. So the result of that is, yes, you got these vaqueros buying things like toilet paper and hygiene and selling them for big profit. The other result is other things that aren't price controlled have a much, much higher price markup to sort of make up for that. And businesses have to, otherwise they won't stay afloat.
We only have a few moments left. What do you think of this book?
I thought it was pretty eye-opening. I'm not someone who actually really knows a whole lot about socialism in practice, and really it's sort of the economic nuances that go along with that. And so this really, to me, opened up a lot of avenues into that and showed me just the different layers upon layers that can go into making economics for an entire country complex.
Absolutely. I know very little about Venezuela and how their economy works, how their government works. This book was pretty foreign to me, but the examples that he used, including the tissue paper and stuff like that, that was something that we see as, regular, household items, and putting that in perspective for them, it really made it easy to read and made it enjoyable and kind of put it in perspective that we can understand. So I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I thought it was a well-written book, and it certainly gave you an idea that the oil prices have one hellacious impact on this economy. He certainly did that in the whole thing of the Second World War period, how you see coffee and cocoa farmers unable to grow because they're not going to be able to sell their products and compete, and you ended up having sort of a destruction of the rest of the economy, and so the infrastructure is all gone. So the book does a good job of that. So yeah, we'd recommend it. Thank you for joining us today.